Mark sat alone at the far end of the conference table, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was sleek and modern, filled with the sharp edges of glass and steel. Outside the tall windows, the city hummed with life, but inside, a heavy silence hung like a thick fog. Mark had always been the quiet type. He preferred to observe rather than participate, letting the words of others wash over him like a distant ocean wave. Today, however, felt different. Today, he was restless. He watched as the board members filed in, their expressions ranging from confident to anxious. Each person took their seat, adjusting papers and tapping screens, but Mark kept still, clutching his hands together to hide their slightest shake. As the clock ticked steadily, he couldn't shake the unease brewing inside him. The topic of discussion today was critical. The future of the company was at stake. Mark had been with the company for years, working diligently behind the scenes, never craving the spotlight. He knew the risks they faced, the shifting landscape of their industry, and more than anything, he wanted to contribute. When the meeting began, the CEO, a charismatic man named Thomas, stood to speak. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, projecting an air of authority that filled the room. Each word he spoke was carefully weighed, and Mark listened intently as he laid out the company's challenges. There was mention of budget cuts, layoffs, and a shift in their strategic vision. Mark felt a tight knot in his stomach as Thomas detailed the plan moving forward. The board members nodded in agreement, their faces animated with ideas. Yet for Mark, the fear grew. Was this direction truly the right one? He desperately wanted to voice his thoughts, but felt the familiar pull of doubt. Would anyone even care what he thought? As the conversation progressed, he observed the dynamics at play. Some board members were aggressive, pushing their points with passion. Others were cautious, carefully weighing every suggestion. Mark's grandfather had once told him that silence can be as powerful as words. It stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he sat back, absorbing the tension in the room. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of someone he recognized. It was David, a former colleague now known for his daring approach to business. Mark hadn't seen him in years, as David had climbed the corporate ladder quickly, leaving behind those who once called him a friend. It felt surreal to see him sitting at the head of the table, effortlessly leading the discussion with a confidence Mark wished he had. As David spoke, Mark's thoughts spiraled. David had always been the bravest among them, always ready to take risks. He remembered their late-night brainstorming sessions filled with laughter, and how David would urge him to speak up, telling him he had great ideas. But over the years, Mark had let fear overtake him. Seeing David now, he wished he had taken more chances, had seized those moments when the words were right on the tip of his tongue. As the meeting continued, David raised his voice, advocating for a bold new strategy that felt risky to everyone but him. Mark's pulse quickened. Each word that David spoke felt like a call to arms, igniting a fire within Mark that he couldn't ignore. Yet with each passing moment, he still didn't speak up. Instead, he felt frozen in time, a spectator to a show he should have been part of. Suddenly, David turned his attention to the board, urging them to take a leap of faith, to explore innovative solutions instead of clinging to tried and true methods. The room was electric. Mark could see their eyes lighting up, and he prayed for David's bold vision to resonate. Just as things began to shift in favor of this new idea, Thomas interjected, presenting concerns that seemed to put a damper on the enthusiasm. David, while I appreciate the spirit of your proposal, we don't know if our stakeholders will support such a radical change. Mark clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to yell, to scream that stability often meant stagnation. That just sticking to the safe path led to mediocrity, but he stayed silent. The weight of his words sat heavy on his chest, an anchor keeping him grounded while everyone else seemed to fly. The discussion moved back and forth, but the same pattern unfolded, David's boldness countered by Thomas's caution. The tension hung thick, buzzing with unspoken words like a storm cloud ready to burst. Time passed painfully slow, and Mark felt a desperate urge growing inside him. He was at a precipice now, teetering on the edge of a decision. Finally, in a moment that felt like it belonged in a movie, David paused. He scanned the table, taking note of the resistance. Then he turned to Mark, locking eyes with him. It was as if a floodgate had opened. Mark felt it in his gut. The room fell into an eerie silence. Mark's heart raced. All eyes were on him now. There was no more hiding. He struggled to find his words, panic coursing through him. I think, he began, his voice shaky but gaining strength. I think we need to embrace innovation. It's terrifying, yes, but it's how we grow. A moment of confusion spread across the faces in the room. They didn't expect this from him. David's smile broke through the tension, encouraging. Mark pressed on, suddenly aware of the power of his voice. What we've done in the past can't be the only way forward. Those who fear change are often those who suffer the most when it comes. I say we take a risk. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, shame and pride mingling together. Still, David nodded and the atmosphere shifted. There was a new spirit in the room as more voices joined the chorus. Mark had spoken, and by doing so had ignited a flame of possibility. Encouraged by the support, David used Mark's words as a springboard. Exactly, we don't have to abandon everything we've built. Instead, we can build on it, adapt it into something new, he said, enthusiasm pouring from him. The conversation blossomed from there, Ideas flowed, yet Mark felt a swell of disbelief. He had finally stepped into the light, and the shadows of doubt that once tethered him fell away piece by piece. It was as if he had been dormant for far too long, and now he could see clearly. As the meeting ended, Mark felt a rush of exhilaration and relief. It astonished him how he had once feared the boardroom, but now he felt empowered. He had taken that leap, walked into uncertainty, and as they wrapped up, Mark looked to David. "Thank you for encouraging me. I've missed this," Mark said, smiling. David clapped a hand on his shoulder, a grin lighting up his face. "You've always had it in you. Keep speaking up." With those words, a bond rekindled, one forged in shared ambition and a recognition of change. Mark left the meeting feeling more alive than ever, the dark clouds of fear fading into a clear blue sky. He had opened a door, and now he wanted to walk through it again and again. Weeks passed, and slowly the new strategy began taking shape. The board became accustomed to Mark's input, which blossomed into a regular part of their discussions. He discovered that each time he spoke up, he lost a little more of the doubt that once chained him down. He became a vital part of the team, united in the mission to move forward. Every breath felt lighter than before, and he found comfort in collaboration. Walking out of meetings, he felt the fresh air hit his skin like a warm embrace, invigorating and full of promise. Then one day, a large project was on the line, a chance for the company to step into new markets. Mark's ideas were pivotal, presenting a clear path forward. As his confidence soared, he became vigilant and proactive, exploring new avenues and solutions like never before. When they finally presented to the investors, standing before the room full of eager eyes, Mark took a step forward and spoke without hesitation. "But what we offer is more than profits. What we build is a future, a vision that aligns with community values and bold innovation." It was electrifying. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in his life, Mark felt what it was to lead, if only in spirit. As he stepped down from the podium, he spotted David in the back of the room, pride radiating from his familiar smile. They locked eyes, and in that moment, it wasn't just recognition, it was acknowledgement. Mark had waited in silence long enough, but now he was part of something bigger than himself. The shift had begun within him, and he had found his voice, not just in the boardroom, but in the narrative of his life. The soft hum of the overhead projector filled the room, but it was barely a whisper against the roar of Mark's heartbeat. He stood at the back, watching the faces around the boardroom table flicker in and out of focus, their expressions a blend of anticipation and anxiety. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Mark felt like a ghost in the shadows, present, yet invisible. It was the day of the quarterly board meeting, and everything weighed heavily on him. His stomach twisted into knots as he recalled the months leading up to this moment. Months of late nights and countless hours spent poring over numbers, trends, and forecasts. He had insights that could change the outcome, and yet, here he was, paralyzed by his own silence. The CEO, a charismatic figure named Thomas, strode into the room, exuding confidence. His presence seemed to draw the energy up a notch, and all eyes turned to him. Mark shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling a sense of urgency mixed with pure dread. The agenda was set to cover a major shift in strategy, and deep within, he knew the direction they were headed was fraught with peril. As Thomas began to speak, Mark's mind raced, grappling with the dread of what lay ahead. To his left, Amanda was taking notes, her pen flying across the notepad like she was recording the next great novel. Across the table, David, a former colleague known for his cutthroat ambition, was already dissecting the presentation with a piercing gaze. Mark remembered when they were allies rather than competitors. Back then, every brainstorming session had felt like a collaboration fueled by passion. Now it felt like a battlefield, and he was paralyzed in the trenches. "Today we're looking to adjust our strategic approach," Thomas declared, oblivious to Mark's internal storm. Mark felt the walls of his resolve closing in. The topic gripped him. He had ideas that could help them innovate, ideas that could steer the company away from the edge, but the silence gnawed at him. His grandfather had always told him that silence could be a powerful ally. Mark just never thought it would feel so much like a prison. As the discussion flowed, Thomas highlighted the pitfalls of their current trajectory. "We cannot keep clinging to the old ways if we want to grow," he warned, his gaze intense. Mark felt a pang of recognition at those words. He understood the gravity of the situation, he just didn't know how to articulate it. The air thickened with every passing moment, swirling with shared doubts and fears. Reputations were at stake, and the wrong move could spell disaster. Thomas asked, pulling the spotlight onto his former friend. Mark watched as David leaned forward, a practiced smile flashing across his face. "Absolutely," he replied, exuding confidence. "We should consider cutting costs by streamlining our department." The room echoed with nods of approval. Mark felt the heat rising in his chest. This wasn't just about whiteboards and pie charts. It was about lives, careers, futures. Jay had taught him that decisions were best made with full disclosure and collaboration, not quick cuts and backdoor strategies. But every time Mark opened his mouth to speak, the words froze on his tongue. What if the room dismissed him? What if David dismissed him? Thomas shifted gears, and the floor was open for more ideas. He scanned the room, looking for input. Mark felt all eyes turn to him, the pressure mounting until it was almost unbearable. Just then David turned toward him, a mix of curiosity and challenge in his gaze. "Mark, I know you're always analyzing the numbers. What do you think about the current strategy?" The room fell dead silent as Mark's heart splintered. It was like being on a stage with no script. Everyone was waiting for him, but his mind raced like a car out of control. "Settle down," he told himself. This was his moment, but doubt wrapped around his throat like a noose, squeezing tighter. He began battling to find words, but then the silence stretched, and in those difficult seconds his mind went blank. He could feel anger boiling beneath the surface, both at himself and David, who had challenged him without an ounce of understanding. "Never mind," he stammered, the words barely making it past his lips. "I think we should, The disappointment settled like dust over him. With that one slip, he had pushed himself back into the shadows, trapped once again by his own insecurities. David raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. The chance had slipped away, and Mark felt like a bystander watching life pass him by. As the meeting continued, Mark listened intently but found it harder to focus. Every nod of agreement, every clap of approval for David's ideas felt like a jab to his gut. He was slowly becoming a ghost, haunting the edges of discussions but never stepping into the light. After an hour of back and forth, the tension hung in the air like a storm ready to break. Finally, Thomas wrapped up. "We'll need to organize another meeting to flesh out these ideas." As the room cleared, Mark sat back feeling hollow. In his heart, he knew he had failed. Failure isn't just missing a target, it's realizing you didn't even take the shot. The weeks rolled on, but every time the team met, Mark felt himself fade further into silence. He had become disengaged, watching David's continued rise like a distant storm brewing on the horizon. Meanwhile, his own dreams felt more elusive by the minute. Then one fateful day, he found himself grabbing lunch in the cafeteria, still caught in a cycle of disappointment. Sitting alone, he watched coworkers mingle and strategize, their laughter drifting through the air, while he picked at his sandwich, feeling it turn to dust in his mouth. That was when he spotted David at another table, gesturing with animation, drawing everyone into his contagious energy. The sight lit a fire in Mark's heart. For the first time in weeks, he felt something, the need to reclaim his voice, to step out of the shadows. He took a deep breath. Maybe today was not just another day. Maybe it was a chance to finally speak up. He affirmed it within himself. The time for waiting was over. With resolve, Mark pushed away from the table and made his way across the cafeteria. He approached David, who looked up surprised. It took everything within him to fight the urge to dart away again. "David," Mark said, his voice steady. "Of course," David answered, genuine curiosity lighting his features. "I have some thoughts about the recent strategy." David nodded, intrigued. "Absolutely." Seated together, the conversation unfolded. Mark shared his insights, his reservations, even the research he'd compiled. With each word, he found himself gaining momentum. David's eyes widened with interest, and he leaned forward, soaking it all in. The power of speaking up washed over Mark with each passing second. Not just the thrill of sharing his ideas, but the realization that he was capable of engaging, of collaborating, of effecting change. What once felt impossible was becoming the new norm. As they spoke, Mark could suddenly envision the possibilities, a team approach that melded ideas, a strategy built on transparency rather than fear. By the time they wrapped up, David was nodding enthusiastically. "Let's take this to Thomas." Later that afternoon, Mark stood in front of the new proposal, nerves bubbling beneath the surface as the board members gathered again. With the meeting underway, David championed Mark's ideas, turning to him regularly for support. "Mark has some fantastic insights that could reshape our approach moving forward," David said, clearly impressed. Mark's heart soared. The same voices that once felt so overwhelming now felt like allies. The board engaged, and soon Mark found himself speaking with conviction, threading his thoughts into the fabric of their conversation. "Instead of cutting costs, what if we focused on innovation?" he said, and something shifted in the room. He watched as Thomas leaned in, his eyes alive with interest. "I like where you're headed, Mark." The words flowed, rich with detail and enthusiasm. Each idea sparked the curiosity of others around the table. Mark felt like he was finally soaring above the limits he had self-imposed. Together, they all began crafting solutions, brainstorming ways to evolve rather than retreat. As the weeks transformed into months, this new direction blossomed into something incredible, rapidly gaining traction. Mark became a driving force within the team, embraced for his freshness and perspective rather than feared for his silence. The shadows that had once cloaked him fell away. At the next board meeting, Mark stood confidently beside David, both champions of the strategy they'd developed. This time, when the presentation wrapped up, applause erupted around the table. The transformation happened not because of him alone, but because he had finally chosen to step into the light. In the closing moments of the meeting, Thomas turned to both of them. "You both have shown remarkable insight." Later, as they walked out, David clapped him on the back. "I knew you had it in you." Mark felt the weight of those words. Once trapped in silence, now he had discovered confidence, significance, and more importantly, community. As they descended the elevator together, Mark contemplated how far he had come, how many moments had slipped through his fingers in silence and doubt. Yet now he stood at the precipice of possibility, ready to embrace whatever came next. He had broken free, emerging not just as a team player but as a leader. He had waited in silence, but that silence had become strength. This was just the beginning. Mark sat in the back of the crowded conference room, his heart racing as he watched the clock tick down to the start of the meeting. It was a big day for the company, a day that could change everything. The boardroom was filled with powerful figures, each one buzzing with anticipation. But Mark, he felt like a ghost, invisible amidst the whirlwind of excitement and tension. He had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, poring over projections and strategies, crafting a plan that could propel the company into a new era. But now, as he waited silently, those carefully formulated thoughts felt like distant echoes. He could already picture his colleagues, their confident, animated faces leading the discussion. Mark was the quiet one, the observer, the one who stayed in the shadows. The CEO, Thomas, strode into the room with an air of authority. He was a master of ceremonies, his voice commanding attention as he quickly set the tone for the meeting. Today, he began, we're discussing our new direction. The market is shifting and we must shift with it. Mark felt the weight of those words pressing against him. He understood the stakes. His own thoughts swirled within him, begging for an escape. He had visions of innovative strategies and untapped potential, but self-doubt tangled them up, leaving him silent. As Thomas began to outline the challenges ahead, Mark knew the company desperately needed a new approach, but fear kept his ideas locked away. Across the table, David sat, the golden boy of the firm. His resume was sparkling, and he had a reputation for taking risks. Mark admired him, even envied him. David thrived in the spotlight, unafraid to speak his mind with authority. He leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence as he scanned the room, taking mental notes of the audience. He was the kind of man who thrived on adrenaline, ready to seize the moment. Mark's stomach twisted as David's gaze fell on him for a brief second, waiting expectantly for his input. The heartbeat in his ears thundered until Mark felt like he might drown in the sound. He shook his head slightly, hardly registering he had done so. Why was he letting this happen? Why couldn't he just speak up? The meeting progressed and Mark listened closely. As Thomas laid out the financial shortcomings, he could feel the tension rising in the room. The more Thomas spoke, the more anxious Mark became. But no sound emerged. Instead, he remained frozen, a statue made of fear. I believe we need to streamline our operations, Thomas said, captivating the room. Mark's chest tightened at those words, cutting costs without considering innovation. That would suffocate their growth. The image of the company stagnating under outdated methods flashed before his eyes. It wasn't just numbers and projections, it was lives and futures. He could see the glimmers of hope being extinguished by short-sightedness, but still he said nothing. David chimed in, leaning forward with enthusiasm. I think we should consider downsizing some departments and reallocating those funds toward increasing shareholder value. The room buzzed with agreement, yet Mark felt his pulse quickening. This approach sounded dangerously like a death sentence for creativity. The vibrant ideas he had wanted to share floated just out of reach like shadows. Thomas asked, scanning the room once more. Mark's heart raced as he felt eyes landing on him. The silence stretched painfully long. The moment hung there like an unfinished melody, and still he couldn't bring himself to speak. But his words trailed off. A wave of shame washed over him. Fear poured in as he saw smiles form on the lips of those around him. They believed he could contribute something, but all he could do was sit in silence as David led the charge into danger. As if reading his thoughts, David turned his attention back to him and said, Mark, what are your thoughts on scaling back to cut costs, looking at the numbers you provided? The challenge hung there, a gauntlet thrown down. Mark felt anger rise, bubbling just beneath the surface. Did no one understand that cutting costs was only half the battle? He could feel the fire stirring within him. In a rare moment of clarity, he felt his predicament shift. He had been quiet for too long. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about the future, his future. But instead of speaking, he lowered his gaze and nodded weakly. Goodbye, passion. Goodbye, hope. Mark wanted to scream, to throw down his notebook and shout his thoughts until they reverberated through the walls. And yet he remained silent, each minute weighing heavier than the last. The meeting wrapped up without him. As the executives streamed out, Mark stayed behind, clutching his notepad like a life preserver. All the plans and strategies that had once felt so powerful now felt like whispers in a storm. He was drowning in regret, watching opportunities slip through his fingers. In the days that followed, Mark became a ghost in his own life. He'd clock in, put his head down, and process spreadsheets while the same conversations rang out around him. He observed his colleagues thrive, watched David and Thomas lead boldly, and the silence of his own voice grew painfully loud. Every interaction felt like a missed chance, a reminder of how frightened he had become. For years, he had embraced his role as the quiet one, the dependable worker, but now that role felt like a shackle. Weeks turned to months, and slowly the company began to threaten layoffs. The buzz in the air turned ominous as uncertainty spread like wildfire. Mark felt it course through him. He had wanted to speak up before, but now with people's jobs on the line, silence no longer felt like a safe harbor. It felt like a death sentence. Mark, Amanda, a close colleague, said one afternoon, her eyes glistening with concern, "You've got to say something." Mark looked at her, realizing she was right. The company was teetering on a cliff edge, and his insights lingered like storm clouds. They needed a new strategy, they needed innovation, collaboration, fresh ideas. For so long he had waited in silence, watching potential slip away. Directly across the hall in a glass-walled conference room, the next board meeting was being adjusted. Thomas called for yet another round of numbers. "We have to decide, team." Sitting there, Mark felt a surge of resolve. It burst forth unexpectedly. Today would be different, it had to be. He stood up and nearly shocked himself with the sudden movement, but he pressed forward, filling his lungs with courage. This was it. This was his moment. He stepped into the conference room, heart racing as he caught sight of dozens of curious faces. David looked surprised, raising an eyebrow in shock. Mark. His pulse quickened. Every eye turned to him, expectations hanging in the air like a weight. He could feel the familiar panic creeping in, but there was something different this time. This was his opportunity to break free from the cocoon of silence he had woven around himself. "We need to pivot," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "If we keep focusing on cutting costs, we'll remain stagnant. Instead, we need to invest in areas that foster growth." As he spoke, he saw heads nodding. Earnest looks encouraged him. This was what he had been waiting for, not just to speak, but to be heard. David jumped in, his expression shifting to surprise mixed with intrigue. "You're onto something." The question ignited Mark's spirit. He poured forth everything he had to offer. He spoke of collaboration, team empowerment, inviting new voices to the table. He painted a vivid picture of what was possible. "Imagine revitalizing our brand, reaching communities we have yet to even consider." As he continued, he began to notice the board members leaning forward, captivated. Something shifted. He transformed from the silent observer into a leader standing before them. When he finally finished, an electric silence followed. Mark could hardly breathe, waiting for their reaction. Thomas, after a moment of contemplation, broke the hush. "I appreciate this, Mark." Cheers erupted around the room. Energy filled the space like a live wire. Mark felt warmth flood his veins. This was not just acknowledgement, it was acceptance. In the weeks that followed, Mark found himself entwined in a whirlwind of excitement and collaboration. They moved forward, gathering funds for research and marketing as teams were revitalized. It felt remarkable, and he reveled in the experience of contributing to something greater than himself. The team responded, brainstorming sessions flourished, and their new approach began to shift momentum. Slowly, the panic of layoffs faded as excitement over the new direction mounted. Through it all, Mark stayed close to David, now finding a steady rhythm between them. They collaborated, they thrived together. They grew not just as colleagues, but as allies navigating the turbulent waters of business. Months passed, and soon it was time for the next board meeting, a pivotal moment where they would discuss the results of their new strategy. Mark stood at the back of the room, peering through the glass walls as the conversation unfolded. Thomas stood tall at the head of the table, and Mark couldn't help but feel pride swelling within him. "Today, we're reporting significant growth across several departments. I want to recognize Mark for spearheading many of these new initiatives," he said, smiling. As applause erupted and David clapped Mark on the back with genuine appreciation, Mark's heart raced. He had gone from being the silent one to being celebrated, and it felt surreal. Later, as people filtered out of the room, a sense of fulfillment washed over him. David approached, a glint of camaraderie in his eyes. "You were incredible today, Mark." Mark felt gratitude swell deep within him. He had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The weight had been agonizing, but it had transformed into strength. In that boardroom, he had reclaimed his voice, shattering the chains of doubt that once bound him. He had waited in silence, but the silence no longer defined him. He had stepped into the narrative, grasping control, and now there was no stopping him. The future was bright, and he was ready for whatever came next. The journey had just begun. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the overhead lights, and the only sound was the rustle of papers as the board members settled into their seats. Mark sat in the corner, his heart racing. It was a day filled with tension, a day that could change everything. He watched as the high-powered executives surrounding the polished table exchanged nervous glances. Today was the quarterly meeting, and the stakes were higher than ever. Mark had always been the one who stood back, the observer. He preferred to let others take the spotlight while he quietly engaged with the numbers, the details, and the projections. But today felt different. Today he questioned his choice to remain silent. Today he felt the urge to speak up more than ever. Thomas, the charismatic CEO, strode into the room, exuding an air of confidence that instantly captured everyone's attention. As soon as he began to speak, the room crackled with energy. "We're at a crossroads," he said, his voice firm and clear. "The market is shifting, and we need to pivot quickly." Mark's mind raced. He had spent weeks preparing charts and analyses. He had ideas that could propel the company forward, yet fear gnawed at him, holding him back. He had sat in meetings like this one before, shoulders tense, heart pounding, watching as others dominated the conversation with their loud voices and sweeping gestures. And each time he had let the moment pass. Across the table sat David, a fierce competitor with an uncanny ability to command the room. Mark had admired him for years. David thrived in the limelight, effortlessly sharing his bold proposals and captivating his audience. He leaned back in his chair, a confident grin on his face as he casually scanned the room, taking mental notes of who might support his ideas. Let's talk about cost-cutting measures, Thomas continued, shifting gears. We need to streamline operations to remain competitive. Every department must justify its budget. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Cutbacks always felt like a safe bet to the upper management, but he believed there was so much more they could do. Instead of suggesting new ventures or innovative products, Thomas was pushing a plan that could stifle creativity and dampen morale. But as Mark stared at the faces around him, he felt paralyzed. What difference could his voice really make in a room filled with such strong personalities? The discussion unfolded, each board member echoing the sentiment. We need to tighten our belts, one member said. Reallocate resources, suggested another. And there it was, the old habits that suffocated the company's growth mingling with the air in the room. Finally, David leaned forward, his voice deep and assured. I propose we downsize a few departments and redirect those funds towards marketing initiatives. As he spoke, Mark felt a familiar pang of frustration. David's suggestion seemed short-sighted. Cutting jobs would not only hurt morale, but it would also stifle the very innovation they desperately needed. Mark had a vision, a plan that promoted collaboration and investment in their workforce, not destruction. But the words remained locked inside him like a caged bird. Thomas asked, looking around the table, inviting input. Mark felt the eyes of his colleagues glide over him. His pulse quickened. This was his moment, but instead of rising to the occasion, he shrank back. Silence filled the room as Mark fought with himself, desperately searching for the courage to speak. I think he started, but doubt crept in and he faltered. The words barely escaped his lips, and in that instant the noise of the world faded. All eyes turned towards him, the weight of their expectation pressing down like a heavy blanket. There was a flash of confusion across Thomas's face, and for a fleeting moment Mark thought he saw a flicker of interest before it quickly vanished. Mark, we're discussing tough choices here, David interjected, a condescending tone creeping into his voice. You have to be practical. Mark's heart sank. The challenge felt daunting, weaving through the tension in the room. After a moment of hesitation, he responded, I think we should explore potential growth avenues instead of just cutting costs. We have potential markets waiting for us. Nice theory. David cut him off, dismissing Mark's ideas as if they were inconsequential. Mark felt the heat rush to his cheeks, and self-doubt washed over him like a cold wave of water. He sat back, feeling once again like a mere observer in his own life. The discussion moved on without him, and every spoken word only deepened the ache in his chest. The meeting continued, painfully dragging until the agenda was complete. As everyone filtered out of the room, Mark remained seated, staring blankly at the table. He wanted to scream, to unleash the pent-up frustration that brewed inside him. Instead, he was left with the weight of missed opportunities and a sense of incompleteness. Days turned into weeks, and each passing moment felt heavier than the last. Mark began to internalize the feelings of regret and disappointment, allowing them to seep into his daily life. The vibrant ideas he had envisioned now felt like distant memories. He observed as David continued to climb the corporate ladder, seizing every chance while Mark's silence turned into a prison. Work became a monotonous routine. Mark sat behind his computer, churning out reports, lost in a haze of frustration. His once gleaming ambitions faded under the bright fluorescent lights of the office. He knew he could do more. He had seen enough evidence to suggest that creativity and boldness could lead them forward. One afternoon, seated alone at his desk during lunch, he overheard a conversation just outside the conference room. Amanda, a colleague with a similar passion for innovation, voiced her concerns about the company's trajectory. We have to work together and brainstorm new strategies. Mark's heart raced. Those words ignited a spark within him. Perhaps it was the time to reclaim his voice, to leave behind the excuses and the silence. Maybe if he spoke, it could resonate. He watched as Amanda and another colleague debated the direction they needed to take, and in that moment, a determination surged within him. He could no longer wait. Gathering his courage, he approached Amanda and the others, interrupting their heated discussion. I want to help, Mark said, his voice steadier than he felt. I have ideas. We can rework our approach and explore new markets. To his surprise, Amanda turned to him with genuine enthusiasm. Yes, that's exactly what we need. We can set up a brainstorming session. As they began to collaborate, ideas flowed freely, a crucible of creativity that felt alive. Mark found himself gaining traction, speaking up more and contributing in ways that ignited his passion. They sketched out plans, strategies, even new initiatives that could enhance productivity and invigorate the company's culture. Days passed and the wheels began to turn. Together, they crafted a fresh proposal to present to Thomas. They prepared, rehearsing, refining every word until each one felt crucial. Mark could feel his heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment he had waited for, the chance to break through the barriers of silence he had built around himself. When the time came, the air in the conference room buzzed with energy. Mark sat at the table, eyes fixed on Thomas as he surveyed the room looking for fresh ideas. His colleagues reminisced about their recent successes, each voice filled with excitement, and there was David, leaning back with his usual confident demeanor. With a nod from Thomas, Mark took a deep breath, ready to unleash the floodgates of creativity. We believe that instead of merely cutting costs, we should be investing in new technologies and market research. If we're willing to explore new avenues, we can create solutions that resonate deeply with our customers, he stated, finally stepping into the light. The room went quiet. For a moment, all eyes turned toward him, including David's. That sounds risky, David said, raising an eyebrow. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his chance. What we gained by not innovating would be worth far more than any short-term savings. Our competitors are already moving in this direction. Slowly, the room began to nod in agreement. Thomas leaned forward, reflecting thoughtfully. You've done your homework. Mark continued, sharing insights driven by collaborative brainstorming. As he wove their ideas into a cohesive plan, he could feel the tides shifting. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about a team coming together, united by a shared vision for their future. When they concluded, applause erupted, filling the room with an electric energy. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Finally, he had found his voice and it resonated with others. After the meeting, David approached him, a mixture of respect and curiosity in his expression. You're really onto something, Mark. We'll need to keep working through the details, but I appreciate how you've stepped up. Mark felt a rush of triumph. This was different from before. He was no longer an outsider watching from the shadows. He was part of a movement, part of something transformative. As weeks turned into months, the company implemented their new strategy and Mark took a leading role. He thrived on collaboration, sharing ideas, and working alongside colleagues to make their vision a reality. The once feared meetings turned into vibrant brainstorming sessions, pulses of energy coursing through the room as new ideas flowed freely. Mark watched as the new strategy took root, growing beyond what he had imagined. The company flourished, employees felt buoyed by creativity, and the atmosphere transformed into one of hope. He felt invigorated each day, anticipating what the next meeting would bring. One crucial board meeting came, and Thomas opened the floor for updates. Mark felt the rush of excitement as he prepared to present their progress. He stood confidently, fueled by the collective energy of his colleagues who believed in him. As he spoke, it felt like coming full circle. He had moved from silence to clarity, from self-doubt to empowerment. Each word was now infused with meaning, grounded by experience and supported by a team. When he finished, a warm round of applause enveloped him once more. The approval of his colleagues offered a sense of completion, filling him with elation. Mark had come to realize something invaluable. Waiting in silence was no longer an option. That silence had served its purpose. It had been a crucible, shaping him for something greater. Thomas nodded appreciatively. Well done, Mark. You found your footing, and your contributions have made an immense impact. In that moment, as the applause faded and colleagues surrounded him with congratulations, Mark understood that he had crossed a threshold. No longer confined by fear, he was walking a path of purpose. He had waited in silence, but now he was a voice of reason, a champion of innovation, and he was ready to lead. The journey had just begun. The conference room was buzzing with anticipation, filled with the whisper of paper and the soft tap of shoes on polished floors. Mark sat at the back, watching the scene unfold. His palms were slick with sweat, and his heart raced like an engine ready to explode. It was the day of the quarterly board meeting, and he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. In a matter of minutes, the CEO, Thomas, would walk in, and with him, the energy of the room would shift. Mark had spent weeks preparing, analyzing data, crafting presentations, envisioning strategies that could change the trajectory of the company. But now he was frozen in place, gripped by anxiety as he waited in silence, wondering if he would dare to speak up. The walls surrounded him, sleek and cold, reflecting the corporate culture he both admired and feared. The sterile room hummed with tension. The stakes were as high as the skyscrapers glittering outside the glass windows. Mark glanced toward the front of the room, where a long table awaited the board members, confident and poised. He had always been the quiet observer, the one who preferred to listen, but today felt different, felt charged. He could almost sense the moment teetering on the edge of something monumental. Thomas's voice boomed as he entered, instantly commanding the room. He had a presence that crackled with electricity, better than any morning coffee. The board members straightened in their seats, focusing all their attention on him. Today we're discussing our future, Thomas continued, his eyes scanning the room like a seasoned general surveying his troops. We've faced challenges, yes, but we also have opportunities. Mark's pulse quickened. He had visions for innovation swirling in his mind, ideas ripe for the taking. But each passing second wrapped him tighter in doubt. What if they dismissed his thoughts? What if he faltered? The fear silenced him, a chain that had grown over years of self-doubt. First on the agenda, let's talk about the budget cuts, Thomas said, handing out sheets filled with numbers. We need to tighten our belts, folks. Mark felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The notion of cutting costs seemed so safe, so easy, but it also felt dangerously short-sighted. Sure enough, the heads around the table nodded in agreement, each member quick to back the decision. We need to streamline, David chimed in from across the table, his confidence radiating like a spotlight. He was the golden boy, always ready to pitch a bold move and earn the applause. Downsizing some departments would allow us to redirect resources toward high-impact areas, David continued, and Mark's heart sank lower. The idea of cutting staff struck him hard. He could see the ripple effects, job loss, disengagement, fear. Wasn't there a better way to grow? But here he sat, trapped in silence once more. Thomas looked around, his gaze casually sweeping over Mark. Mark's stomach twisted. This was his chance. He had insights that could shift the conversation entirely. He took a breath, only to watch as doubt clouded his mind like a sudden storm. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Silence wrapped around him, stifling. And just like that, he felt the room shift again, the focus moving away from him. The board continued debating, tossing around jargon while Mark sat invisible, frustration boiling within. Each spoken word was a reminder of his own fears. Why couldn't he just speak up? Why was he so afraid of rejection, of misunderstanding? The thought of failing in front of them gripped him tightly. Hours ticked by, the meeting dragging on as Mark remained silent, listening to the chorus of voices flowing around him. Finally, at the end of the meeting, as people began to collect their things, Mark felt a rush of adrenaline. Humiliated but determined, he knew he had to say something. He started, but no one looked back. The moment had passed, and he felt his shoulders slump. "Never mind," he whispered, feeling defeated as he exited the room. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of that silence sat heavy on his heart. Mark felt disillusioned and detached from the company's direction. Each time he found himself at the office, he became a shadow of his former self, haunted by what could have been. Meanwhile, David continued to push forward, gaining favor and recognition for every bold pitch he made. One afternoon, Mark found himself in the company cafeteria, watching groups of colleagues engage animatedly. Their laughter echoed around the room, a veil over his sense of isolation. He glanced at David's table, where animated discussions and plans for the future unfolded. He couldn't help but feel both admiration and jealousy. Amanda, a fellow analyst, called to him from across the room. She was someone who believed in collaboration, someone who could see value in the quieter perspectives. Mark hesitated, his throat dry. "Maybe next time," he replied. The words slipped out, hollow and unconvincing. Felt the same wave of disappointment wash over him, the fear pulling him back into isolation, but Amanda wouldn't let it go. "You can't keep hiding in here," she said, her tone warm but firm. "We need your insights." At that moment, something shifted. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. He had ideas. He had visions that were waiting to break free. What if they really could rethink how to cut costs without jeopardizing the core strength of the company? "Okay," he said finally, a bit more confidence coloring his tone. Over lunch, conversations flowed and ideas sparked life like fire catching on paper. Mark found himself sharing thoughts, making suggestions that Amanda and others eagerly considered. The more he spoke, the more empowered he felt, like stepping out of a fog into the light. "This could work," Amanda said, her eyes brightening with excitement. "We need to present this to Thomas." Mark nodded, excitement stirring the air. "We can propose reallocating resources in a way that engages employees rather than cuts them." They spent the next few days pushing toward their goal, turning brainstorming sessions into concrete plans. Mark felt invigorated again, like he found a part of himself he thought was lost. Together, they crafted what could be a game-changing proposal, becoming collaborative warriors in a battle that felt all too steep. Finally, the day arrived when they would present to the board once more. Mark stood in front of the group, a knot of nerves twisting in his stomach. He saw familiar faces, Thomas, David, and others all looking expectantly at him. "Today we want to explore ways to meet budget demands while investing in our people," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. There was a flicker of recognition as Thomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Our employees are our most valuable asset." David's expression shifted slightly, and Mark took that brief moment of acknowledgement as a sign to press on. "Instead, we propose reallocating resources toward development programs." As he spoke, ideas flowed seamlessly from his mind to his mouth. Amanda chimed in, outlining how this would lead to enhanced morale and stimulate creativity. With each point made, Mark could feel the room shifting, tension easing. Mark observed the board members, seeing nods of approval where fear had once reigned. As they continued talking, the energy of the room transformed. What began as tension and anxiety was now filled with curiosity and opportunity. The meeting concluded with applause that echoed in Mark's ears like thunder. "Well done," Thomas said, his voice rich with approval. When Mark stepped out of the meeting room, he felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had lifted from his shoulders. This was a new chapter, and he was part of something bigger. He had pushed past the silence, found his voice, and reshaped the narrative. Days turned into weeks once again, but this time, Mark had embraced his role in a way he never thought possible. His ideas were welcomed, his contributions valued. As he collaborated with his colleagues to execute the plans, he felt a sense of belonging grow within him. Through the experience, Mark uncovered something vital. Waiting in silence only held him back. When he finally stepped forward, he had the ability to lead within his team, breathing life into creativity and collaboration. In the final board meeting of the quarter, he stood once again before Thomas and the team. This time it was different. He felt confident, grounded in the knowledge that he had a voice worth sharing. Today, we celebrate our growth, our renewed energy, he began, listening to the way his voice carried through the room. As he looked out over his colleagues, he felt a sense of pride swell within him. Each word was like a nail, staking down the change that had taken place in him and the company. Together, we've turned obstacles into opportunities, and now we stand ready to take the next steps forward. When he concluded, the room erupted into applause again, louder, more heartfelt this time. Thomas nodded appreciatively, while David offered a genuine grin of camaraderie. This time, Mark was no longer the silent observer. He was leading the charge, guiding the team towards a shared vision, and he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment as he embraced everything he had fought to achieve. Mark had waited in silence for too long, but he had discovered the power of his voice. He had transformed the silence into strength. Now the future lay before him, bright and inviting, a promise of what could be. The journey was just beginning, and he was finally ready to seize it. The conference room was consumed by an almost tangible tension, an electric buzz that vibrated through the polished glass and steel. Mark sat at the far end of the table, hands slick with sweat, heart pounding. Today was different. Today could change everything. As the board members took their seats, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread in his gut. The door swung open and Thomas, the CEO, strode in, all charisma and authority, instantly commanding the room's attention. "Let's get started," he said, his voice booming. "We're here to discuss our next steps. The market is shifting and we need to pivot quickly." Mark glanced down at his notes, his pulse racing. He had spent weeks painstakingly analyzing data, crafting proposals, formulating ideas that could help the company thrive. But as the formalities began, his confidence ebbed away like the tide. The board members exchanged glances, their faces a mix of eagerness and trepidation. Each person was ready to stake their claim, but Mark felt invisible, like a spectator to a game he desperately wanted to play. He had always preferred to listen rather than speak, to observe rather than engage, but today felt pivotal. Today he fought the urge to fade into the shadows. "Our financials are concerning," Thomas continued, glancing at the handouts he had distributed. "We're facing increased competition, and if we don't tighten our belts, we risk falling behind. I want ideas on how we can streamline our operations." A hand shot up across the table, David's, who was nothing short of a force of nature. "I think we should consider cutting some departments," he suggested, his voice ringing with conviction. The room hummed in agreement, heads nodding like a synchronized dance. Mark's heart sank. Cutting departments could mean layoffs. It could mean lives disrupted. Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning with the implications of such decisions. He could feel the knots tighten in his stomach, a visceral reaction to the idea of erasing jobs instead of promoting innovation. "We have to be bold," David continued, leaning forward like a predator sensing prey. Another voice chimed in, backing him up. "Absolutely, we need to be leaner." Mark's fingers fidgeted with the edge of his notebook. Their confidence felt suffocating. He glanced around, the board members nodding in agreement as the conversation began to spiral deeper into cost-cutting measures. Thomas asked, eyes scanning the table. Mark could feel the spotlight shifting, the possibility of his moment slipping through his fingers like sand. He took a deep breath, urging himself to speak. I think that he started, but the words caught in his throat like a boulder. The room fell silent, yet somehow inside his chest, a tick-tock noise echoed louder than any heartbeat. All eyes turned toward him. David smirked, sensing an opportunity to interrupt him before he could gather his thoughts. "What do you have in mind, Mark?" Mark's face felt hot. We could explore other avenues, reach new markets, engage our team more instead of just cutting. We should be risky," David interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. "We need to be realistic." And just like that, Mark's voice faltered again, the whispers of doubt clinging tightly. He felt as if he had been pushed back into a corner. He remained silent, churning with frustration as the discussion escalated. They moved on as if he had never spoken at all. Weeks passed, the oppressive weight of that moment hung over him. Each day felt like a cycle of despair as Mark plodded through his tasks. He knew he had great ideas, but fear kept him pinned to the wall as a mere observer. It was painful to watch David rise higher into the organization while Mark felt himself sinking. Sitting alone in the cafeteria one afternoon, he overheard a buzz of excitement at the next table. Amanda, another team member who shared his passion for innovation, was speaking animatedly. We need to focus on collaboration and ingenuity instead of downsizing. Mark's heart accelerated. He felt that flicker of inspiration reignite. What if he could use Amanda's enthusiasm to breathe life into his ideas? Swallowing his fear, he stood up and approached her table. "Amanda, I want to help." Her eyes lit up and she nodded eagerly. "Yes, let's brainstorm together." For the first time in weeks, a rush of adrenaline coursed through Mark. He knelt into collaborative brainstorming with Amanda, speaking openly about his vision. They batted ideas back and forth like a tennis match, laughter mingling with anxiety as they crafted a plan that felt both pragmatic and bold. When they finally sat down to finish the presentation, Mark felt a sense of accomplishment carpeted with the hope he thought he had lost. They compiled data to support their vision, weaving in creative marketing strategies that reinforced Mark's desire to uplift their workforce. "Let's do this," Mark said, a confidence growing within him. As the day of the presentation arrived, Mark's stomach churned with anticipation. Standing in the same conference room where his voice had once been drowned out, he felt different. He had spent days analyzing every detail, refining every point. Today was the moment he would not allow silence to win. Thomas called the meeting to order and Mark took a deep breath. He exchanged glances with Amanda, who nodded reassuringly. "Today we want to present a different perspective," he began, each word ringing with newfound conviction. "We believe that instead of cutting departments, we should invest in our team." He could see the interest flicker across the board members' faces. Encouraged, he continued, "Our employees are our most valuable asset." Each slide clicked past, the visuals vibrant and full of possibilities. Amanda took over, framing the narrative in a way that felt dynamic and collaborative. The energy in the room began to shift as Mark found himself gaining momentum. Instead of the tense atmosphere he had expected, he saw nods of agreement, glances shared, as though they were all on the same journey. When Mark finished, he dared to glance at David, who seemed momentarily caught off guard. The silence felt uncertain, charged. Thomas cleared his throat, leaning forward with interest. "This approach is intriguing," he said. "We need creativity." A ripple of excitement coursed through the room. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. This was different. They weren't just surviving, they were starting to think bigger. As he basked in the moment, he knew it was not just about him anymore. It was about the entire team stepping into the light. The meeting concluded with applause, a roar of approval that filled Mark's ears like music. He turned to Amanda, and their shared smiles said it all. They had done it. They had harnessed their voices, refused to let fear define them, and shaped a new narrative that felt so incredibly invigorating. In the weeks that followed, the company embraced their strategy. Morale began to rise as Mark worked closely with various teams to implement innovative programs. Staff engagement soared and the team began to rally together. Mark found himself energized by the collaboration, fostering relationships he never thought possible. One day, Thomas called him into his office. "Mark, the last few months have made a significant difference in our direction." Mark's heart raced at the unexpected praise. "Thank you, Thomas." As he left the office, a wave of gratitude washed over him. The very air felt buoyant, infused with potential. He was no longer the quiet observer hanging on the sidelines, but an integral part of a movement that was shifting the entire company. Then came the day of the next board meeting, a culmination of everything they had worked for. Mark stood at the back of the conference room, nerves bubbling beneath the surface, but he no longer felt the weight of silence. He felt freedom, anticipation for what lay ahead. Thomas opened the meeting, and Mark felt the expectation crackle in the air. "We've seen an increase in productivity and engagement, partly due to the initiatives Mark and Amanda have led," Thomas said proudly. As he spoke, Mark's heart soared. He had come so far from that initial meeting, where his voice had been drowned out by self-doubt. Now he was being celebrated as an essential player in the company's transformative journey. When Mark stood to share updates about their progress, he couldn't hold back the excitement that flowed through him. "We've seen improvement across the board, with engagement surveys showing a significant jump in morale." When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and he could feel the warmth wash over him like sunlight after a long winter. This was a victory not just for him, but for everyone, a validation that together they could overcome obstacles and forge a new path. After the event concluded, David approached him, a genuine smile plastered on his face. "Mark, I have to hand it to you. I underestimated your vision." In that moment, Mark felt a rush of triumph and connection. No longer was he the quiet one waiting in the wings. He had transformed from the silent observer into a leader, someone who could inspire and guide. With each progression, he embraced the power that came from finding his voice. He realized that waiting in silence had served a purpose. It had been part of a journey leading him to this very moment. As he left the boardroom, a new dawn unfurled before him, brimming with promise. He had waited, yes, but that wait had turned into strength. Now he was ready to embrace whatever came next. The stories they would tell together, the paths they would forge, and the innovations to come filled him with hope. The journey had just begun, and he wouldn't be waiting in silence anymore. The conference room door swung open, and the air thickened with anticipation. Mark sat in the back, his heart thumping like a drum. Today was crucial. The board was gathering to discuss the future of the company, and with it, the fate of many careers, his included. He could feel the tension swirling around him, a tangible force. As the members took their seats, the sharp sound of heels echoed on the polished floor. Mark couldn't help but notice the way they were all so composed, so confident. Each executive was a titan in their own right. Meanwhile, he, the quiet analyst, felt like an island among a stormy sea. Would anyone even notice if he slipped away? Thomas, the CEO, stepped in. With a commanding presence and a voice that resonated through the room, he captured everyone's attention. Today, we discuss our analytical reviews and decide our next steps. The challenges we face are real, but so are the opportunities. Mark's pulse quickened. This was his moment. He had spent countless hours analyzing data, poring over trends that could steer the company in a new direction. He had thoughts bubbling just under the surface, but self-doubt choked them back like an iron fist. As Thomas began outlining the company's struggles, Mark felt the familiar gnawing tension in the pit of his stomach. "We're falling behind our competitors," Thomas continued. David, the company's rising star, leaned in with a confident smile. "I agree," he said smoothly. "We have to think about cutting costs, streamlining departments." Mark winced at those words. Cutting costs could mean cutting people. He had seen colleagues let go before, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Felt wrong. This was not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it was about lives. And yet all he could do was watch as the conversation flowed around him like a raging river he couldn't cross. The board members nodded in agreement. "We need to be practical," someone said. Mark's heart sank. He sensed the clock ticking down, and with every tick his courage wavered. This was it. This was when he had to rise up to show the world what he could do. But the voices of doubt whispered incessantly. What if they dismissed him? What if he looked foolish? "Mark," Thomas said, breaking into his thoughts. "What do you think?" The spotlight shifted to him with a heavy thud. All eyes fell upon him, and the world went silent. In that instant, everything inside him screamed to run away. He opened his mouth, but his voice betrayed him. "I think we should," but the words faltered. The silence that followed felt deafening, and all Mark could do was shake his head, retreating into his own skin. "Never mind," he managed, the heat rising to his cheeks. The moment was lost, and once again he was left waiting in silence. The meeting progressed, and Mark felt himself slip further away from the conversation. He hated feeling like a bystander in his own life. The tension in his chest became unbearable, a tight knot of frustration and regret. They continued to discuss cuts, budgets, and strategies, and every word made Mark want to scream. Days turned into weeks, caught in that cycle of silence. Each meeting bled into the next, with Mark feeling like a ghost haunting the walls of the conference room. David continued to rise, pitching bold ideas that caught everyone's attention while Mark floundered in the background, grappling with missed opportunities. One afternoon, as Mark sat alone at his desk, he overheard laughter and animated chatter filtering in from the break room. Amanda, a colleague known for her enthusiasm, was rallying her team for a brainstorming session. "We've got to collaborate on new ideas." A flicker of hope ignited within Mark. Perhaps he could step forward after all. He approached Amanda, shaking off the layers of doubt that clung to him. He asked, his voice a whispered resolve. Amanda replied, her smile warm. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. As they gathered around a table, ideas flowed like a fresh stream of water. He began to share his thoughts, new markets they could explore, innovations in their product line. Each suggestion felt like a brick being laid in a foundation, steady and promising. That was the moment everything shifted. Mark began to voice not just thoughts, but passion, igniting flames of inspiration around the table. Amanda jumped in enthusiastically, her energy fueling their shared vision, and suddenly the weight of waiting in silence felt lighter. "We can propose reallocating resources to develop training programs," Mark suggested, excitement bubbling up. "Invest in our people instead of cutting jobs." "Yes," Amanda exclaimed. They grouped together, building upon each other's ideas, brainstorming until the proposal blossomed into something tangible. As the days rolled on, excitement hung like a mantle around them. Their plan took shape, and everything became real. Mark felt hope stirring within him, a burgeoning sense that perhaps they could influence change together. Finally, the day arrived for them to present their ideas to the board. Mark's nerves kicked in, but he remembered the spark from the brainstorming sessions. They had crafted something meaningful, they just needed to share it. As he stood in the conference room, that familiar weight settled in his chest, but this time he stood taller. Thomas called the meeting to order, and Mark locked eyes with Amanda. "We're here today to discuss a new approach," Mark began, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "Instead of focusing on cuts, we want to explore avenues for growth." He could already see Thomas leaning in, interest peaking. Mark pressed on, sharing data and insights, presenting a case filled with passion and confidence. Amanda's supportive nods helped push him forward, and he could feel the energy in the room change. The board members started to lean forward, eyes brightening. This wasn't just another predictable pitch, it was fresh and invigorating. As Mark concluded, he could sense the wave of approval rippling through the room. When he finished, an unexpected silence followed. Time hung suspended, and Mark could see the board members exchanging glances. Finally, Thomas broke the silence with a broad smile. "Thank you, Mark." The applause that erupted felt like the sound of freedom, the sound of his voice finally being heard. Mark turned to Amanda, who was grinning from ear to ear, and the exhilaration buzzed between them like electricity. They had turned a tide. In the weeks that followed, the company embraced their strategies. They rolled out new training programs and development initiatives that revitalized the workforce. Morale soared and the atmosphere in the office transformed. Mark became a critical player in this shift, finding himself in discussions, leading meetings, engaging with his peers in ways he had never imagined. One afternoon, as he was walking down the hall, Thomas called out to him. Mark's heart raced. What could this be about? He stepped inside and Thomas closed the door. "I wanted to personally thank you for your contributions over the last few months." Stunned, Mark could hardly respond. "Thank you, Thomas. Your part has made a huge difference. I'd like you to present our results in the upcoming board meeting," Thomas said, his eyes meeting Mark's with sincerity. The news sent a thrilling shiver through him. This was it, the culmination of his journey from silence to strong conviction. He was ready to embrace it with open arms. As the day of the board meeting arrived, Mark stood at the back of the room, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Thomas opened the floor. "Today, I'd like Mark to share some insights on our recent initiatives," he said, gesturing toward him. Mark stepped forward, the spotlight warm against his skin. As he presented, he could feel the weight lift with each word spoken. He shared statistics, stories of employee engagement, and the tangible benefits of the new direction they had taken. When he concluded, applause erupted in a wave that washed over him like a euphoric refrain. In that moment, he felt a long-held belief shatter into countless pieces, the belief that he was just a silent bystander. As the meeting wrapped up, Mark caught David's eye. The competitor who had once made him doubt himself now offered a respectful nod. "You're doing a great job, Mark." For the first time, Mark felt the weight of camaraderie. This wasn't about competition. It was about collaboration, growth, and strength, a shared vision that had finally taken root. In the aftermath of the meeting, everything shifted again. Mark was now known not just as an analyst, but as a leader, someone with ideas that could resonate throughout the company. He found himself embraced by a team that celebrated collaboration and creativity, and he became part of something larger than himself. As weeks turned into months, Mark continued to thrive in his newfound role. Going from a silent observer to a powerful voice, he had transformed in ways he had never anticipated. Each day was a new opportunity to inspire change, and he embraced it wholeheartedly. He often reflected on that first board meeting when he had waited in silence, the moment that had sparked everything. He had risen from the ashes of doubt, emerged from the shadows, and took charge of his destiny. In his heart, he knew that the journey was far from over. The challenges ahead would come, but now he was ready to embrace whatever lay in front of him, armed with his voice, his ideas, and a newfound strength. No longer waiting in silence, he was ready to lead. The room was thick with anticipation, and even the ticking clock seemed to pause, holding its breath. Mark sat at the far end of the sleek conference table, hands clasped together, heart pounding in his chest. Today was not just any other meeting. Today felt monumental. This gathering could redefine the future of the company, and his own future too. As the board members filtered in, Mark felt the tension building. Each person carried an air of authority, discussing the day's agenda in hushed tones. But for Mark, it was a different story. He'd spent countless hours crafting ideas, analyzing data, daydreaming about how he could contribute. And yet here he was, enveloped in silence, battling a cascade of doubts and fears. When Thomas, the charismatic CEO, walked in, the atmosphere transformed instantly. He was a force of nature, effortlessly commanding the room's attention with his poise. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice resonating. "We're at a pivotal point in our organization. The market is shifting and we need to innovate." As Thomas continued speaking, Mark felt a familiar tightening in his chest. His heart wanted to leap, to shout out the ideas that had hijacked his thoughts for weeks. But fear gripped him tightly like a vice. What if they rejected him? What if they laughed or worse, ignored him? He glanced around the table, studying the faces of his colleagues. David, the golden boy of the firm, sat with his typical confidence, ready to seize the opportunity. "We need to cut expenses," he asserted, leaning back in his chair, hands crossed behind his head. Mark's insides twisted. The idea of cutting people from the team felt ruthless, and deep down he knew there was a better way. But still he remained silent, the storm inside him raging while the conversation carried on around him. Thomas asked, scanning the table. The silence hung heavy in the air. Mark's heart raced, his breath shallow. This was it. This was his moment to speak up. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, but each time he opened his mouth, doubts drowned his courage. He whispered, barely audible even to himself. David cut him off with a scoff. "What are you suggesting, Mark? More risk?" His tone was dismissive, as if the mere thought of innovation were a foolish distraction. The moment slipped through Mark's fingers like water, and with it, the chance to voice what had been brewing inside him. The discussion continued, the board moving further away from the innovative ideas Mark had prepared, enveloping him deeper into silence. Afterward, as members exchanged pleasantries and exited the room, Mark remained seated, the weight of his failure pressed down heavily. He had waited in silence while others seized opportunities. Days turned into weeks, and Mark felt stuck in a cycle of frustration. Work had become a monotonous routine of numbers and reports, stripped of creativity. The vibrant ideas he once held had turned into quiet reflections in his mind. In the break room, Amanda, a bright and optimistic colleague, rallied a group around her. "We have to push for new strategies." Her passion radiated around the room, sparking hope even in the faces of those who had grown weary. Mark felt a flicker of inspiration. Maybe it was time to join them. He took a deep breath, pushing past the self-doubt that had held him captive. "I'd like to help with brainstorming," he said, surprising even himself. Amanda turned, her exuberance brightening even more. "Absolutely, we need all hands on deck." For the first time in weeks, Mark felt alive. They huddled together, sharing ideas and visions, bouncing thoughts around like a basketball in a game. Mark found himself speaking up more, his confidence fueled by the collective energy. "We can develop training programs instead of cutting staff," he suggested, fervor igniting his voice. "Yes," Amanda replied, and soon others jumped in with enthusiasm. The combination of their ideas swirled like a tornado, gradually taking shape into a proposal that felt both achievable and vibrant. As days of collaboration unfolded, Mark realized his ideas were no longer just whispers in his mind, they were becoming a reality. Proposal took on a life of its own, fueled by a shared passion for renewal. They crafted a detailed plan with data to support their vision, persuading each member of their group about the importance of investing in employees. Finally, they prepared to present their strategy to the board. Mark's tired but exhilarated as he paced outside the conference room, heart thumping wildly. Today was his moment to step into the light. When the meeting began, everyone seemed expectant, faces lit with curiosity. Mark locked eyes with Amanda, their shared energy welling up inside him. "Today we'd like to present a new approach," he started, his voice steady, words flowing with newfound confidence. As he shared their vision, he felt the warmth of recognition around the room. Instead of an audience filled with skeptics, he saw intrigued faces leaning forward. He continued, building excitement, painting pictures of what they could achieve together. David shifted uncomfortably at the table, his earlier confidence wavering. He dared to interject, the challenge evident in his eyes. Mark didn't waver this time. "By investing in growth, we ensure long-term stability." The board members exchanged glances, nodding as the energy began to shift. Thomas leaned forward, absorbing every word. "You're suggesting we focus on the long game," he said, clearly intrigued. "Yes," Mark replied, his voice resonating. He could sense momentum building, the tide turning. When they finished, a silence enveloped the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, one by one, the board began to clap. The applause erupted, and Mark's heart soared with each echoing sound. "Well done, both of you," Thomas said, a smile lighting up his face. "Your approach is exactly what we need." As the meeting concluded, Mark felt a rush, a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. They had done it. Together, they had turned the tide. They had brought momentum back into the company, and he had found a voice that resonated, a voice that had once been silenced. Weeks rolled on, and the company flourished under their new strategy. Engagement improved, and Mark began to feel like an integral part of the team. No longer were his ideas dismissed, they were encouraged. He participated more actively, leading discussions, sharing visions, and confidently steering the wheel. But then came the day that would change everything. Mark was summoned to Thomas's office. Heart racing, he stepped inside to find not just Thomas, but David, the golden boy of the firm, sitting across the table. His casual demeanor masked an undeniable tension. "Thank you both for being here," Thomas began, a serious note in his voice. "We need to discuss something important." Mark's heart thudded. The uneasiness in the room felt palpable. He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sales have dropped. We need to make strategic shifts quickly." The words sliced through the air like a knife. Mark's breath caught. The ground felt like it was shifting beneath him. "But our new strategies are working. We're seeing improvement in morale and engagement." But David leaned forward, concern echoing in his eyes. "Mark, I know you believe in this direction, but we must be realistic." Thomas nodded, his expression grave. Mark's throat tightened. "You can't. We've come so far. What about investing in the team?" He felt desperation creeping into his voice, but he fought through the haze of panic. As the conversation deepened, Mark's mind raced, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Everything he had fought for felt threatened. He had found his voice, and he couldn't let it be drowned out again. "Let's sit down with the whole team," he urged, his voice rising with urgency. Thomas exchanged a glance with David, weighing the moment, and then silence. Everything hung in the balance. Mark could feel the weight pressing down on him, the anxiety clawing at his insides. Would they listen? Would they see that this was a moment for resilience, not retreat? But just then the door swung open, and in walked someone unexpected, a figure who would turn this meeting on its head. The air felt electric as Mark turned to see who it was, sensing that everything was about to change. The tension in the room was thick, every heartbeat resonating with anticipation. What would happen next? Would the tides shift again in their favor, or would silence swallow the room whole once more? The stakes had never been higher, and Mark was ready to fight. As the figure stepped forward, the sound of footsteps echoed, filling the air with a promise of change. What lay ahead could reshape everything.